The doctor saw the DNA results, set the tablet face down on the nurse's station, and whispered 4 words that changed everything. "Leave this hospital tonight." For 8 years, a quiet man had sat at the edges of his wife's world, tolerated, dismissed, talked over at dinner tables and hospital galas by a family who had decided, before they ever knew him, that he was not enough. He drove a sensible car, he kept a sensible job, he never raised his voice, and while his wife's mother spent 8 years looking down at him from the highest floor of her career, she never once looked down at the terminal on the wall, the one she used every single day, and read the name in the corner, his father's name. Because what this family never knew, what his wife never knew, was that the quiet man they had spent 8 years dismissing had been collecting royalty checks on the software running inside the very hospital where they worked, worshipped their credentials, and planned his removal. And the moment that DNA test came back, he stopped being patient. What happened next didn't just cost them money, it cost them everything they thought they were. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now. These stories post every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. If this one already has you locked in, drop a like so more people find it. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. We've got people tuning in from everywhere, and I want to see where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to where this all started. To a hospital room, late at night, with 2 premature babies in a NICU, and a man sitting quietly in a hallway holding a paper cup that had gone cold, about to receive the most important whisper of his life. The hospital had a particular kind of quiet at night, not peaceful quiet, the kind that pressed against your ears and made every sound feel like an announcement. The squeak of a nurse's shoe on linoleum, the low mechanical rhythm of a monitor, the soft, constant hiss of oxygen moving through tubing too small for the lungs it was feeding. Everett Okafor sat in a chair that was bolted to the wall and had not been designed for sitting. His hands were folded in his lap. His back was straight. If you had walked past the NICU waiting area at 9:47 that Tuesday evening and seen him there, you might have thought he was the calmest man in the building. You would have been right. And you would have been completely wrong about what that calm meant. The twins had come 7 weeks early. A boy and a girl, each smaller than a loaf of bread, each with more tubes than Everett could count without his throat tightening. The delivery had been fast and frightening in the way that only medical emergencies can be frightening. Everyone moving with practiced urgency, no one making eye contact with the father, and then suddenly 2 isolettes and 2 sets of monitors and a room that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Renee was resting. She had been moved to a recovery room 2 floors up, and her mother had stayed with her until Renee drifted off, and then Sylvia Tate had come downstairs. That was when the temperature in the NICU changed. Dr. Sylvia Tate walked into that unit the way she walked into every room at St. Augustine Medical Center. Like the building, had been constructed around her schedule. She greeted the charge nurse by her first name. She greeted the neonatology fellow by his last name and asked about his boards in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer and found it acceptable. She repositioned a monitor stand that a nurse had placed exactly where protocol required it to be placed, and she did it without looking at the nurse, and the nurse did not say anything. She had not looked at Everett since she arrived. He watched her move through the unit the way you watch weather, noting it, measuring it, not surprised by any of it. Sylvia stood at the window of the isolette that held the girl, and she pressed one hand flat against the glass, and she said, to no one in particular, but in a voice designed to carry, that the babies were beautiful. She said they had strong hands. Then she turned to include Renee's absence in the room, as though speaking to a daughter who wasn't there, and she said, "They have your father's forehead." Dr. Renee's father had been dead for 11 years. The charge nurse glanced up. She looked at Everett for just a moment, the way people look at someone when something has been said in front of them that should not have been said. Everett looked back at her and gave a small, easy nod that said he was fine. He was not fine. But he had learned, over 8 years, that there was no percentage in showing Sylvia Tate that she had landed something. The comment was not about genetics. Renee's father had been a cardiologist, a man of standing, a man whose name was on a plaque in the hallway 2 floors below them. The comment was about belonging and lineage and the specific, surgical way Sylvia had of reminding everyone in earshot that Everett Okafor was a placeholder in a story that had been written before he arrived. He got up and went to get coffee from the machine down the hall. He was standing there, holding the paper cup, watching the machine run, when Dr. James Morrow appeared beside him. Morrow was a neonatologist. He had been at St. Augustine for 22 years. He had trained under Sylvia's late husband. He had eaten Sunday dinner at the Tate family table. He had baptized Renee's younger brother in a church on Oleander Street on a rainy April morning 15 years ago. James Morrow was not a peripheral figure in this family's life. He was woven into it, thread by thread, holiday by holiday. Which was why, when he appeared beside Everett at the coffee machine, his face carrying an expression Everett had never seen on it before, Everett went still. Morrow looked back toward the NICU doors. He looked at the empty hallway in both directions, and then he leaned in close and spoke in a voice that was barely above breath. He said he knew Everett's father. He said he knew what kind of man Calvin Okafor had been, and he knew what kind of man Everett was. And then he said, "Leave this hospital tonight. Divorce her." He said he would explain everything, but not here and not now. He asked if Everett understood him. He did not wait for an answer. He walked back through the double doors, and they swung shut behind him, and Everett stood in the hallway alone, holding a paper cup that had gone cold, and the linoleum was very bright under the fluorescent lights, and the building was very quiet. He stood there for a long moment, and then his eyes moved, the way eyes sometimes move, to something without the mind directing them, to the patient interface terminal mounted on the wall beside the NICU entrance. The screen Sylvia had used twice tonight to pull charts. The screen that was running, right now, a familiar interface on familiar infrastructure. In the lower right corner of the display, in small grey text, Okafor Systems, version 4.2. Everett looked at it for 3 seconds. He set the paper cup down on the counter beside the machine. He took his phone from his pocket. He dialed a number he had not called in 2 years, and when the line picked up, he said 7 words in the same quiet register he used for everything. "It's time. Start pulling everything together." Then he went back inside. He sat with the twins for 4 more hours. He brought Renee water twice when the nurse let him go upstairs. He did not cry in front of anyone. When Sylvia finally left at midnight, she walked past him without a word, and he watched her go, and his face was the same as it had been all night. At 2 in the morning, Everett Okafor walked out of St. Augustine Medical Center, alone. He did not rush. He did not look back. He crossed the parking lot in the cold air and got into his car and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. He was already decided to understand why that whisper didn't break him, why it steadied him instead, why he walked back into that room and sat for 4 more hours without a tremor in his hands. You have to understand what 8 years had already done to him, and what 8 years had already built. Everett Okafor grew up in a house where the heat sometimes worked, and the food always did. His mother, Loretta, kept a kitchen that smelled like onions and bay leaf from October through March. His father, Calvin, left before sunrise most mornings with a thermos and a canvas bag full of network cables, and came home after dark, smelling like fluorescent lights and cold coffee. They lived in a brick house on Desmond Street with a concrete porch and a fig tree in the backyard that nobody planted. It was just there one spring, and Calvin said that was reason enough to keep it. Everett watched his father work the way some boys watch athletes, with careful attention, with the understanding that what he was seeing was a particular kind of excellence that did not announce itself. He put himself through a state school on scholarship and part-time work, graduated with a degree in information systems, and built a career the same way Calvin built everything, methodically, without drama, one competent decision at a time. By 30, he was a systems manager at a regional healthcare network. He drove a sensible car. He kept a savings account that grew slowly and reliably, the way his father had taught him savings accounts were supposed to grow. He met Renee at a hospital networking event. She was brilliant and warm and laughed at something he said before he had finished saying it, which was the thing that got him. They dated for 14 months. He asked her to marry him on the concrete porch of his mother's house on Desmond Street, with the fig tree in the background, because it was the most honest place he knew. He met Sylvia Tate 6 weeks before the wedding. Sylvia looked at Everett the way a building inspector looks at a foundation, scanning for the thing that was going to become a problem. She shook his hand and smiled, and said it was wonderful to finally meet him, and the word finally carried inside it a small, sharp blade that drew no blood but left a mark. Over dinner, she asked about his work with the specific politeness of someone who had already decided the answer was not interesting. When Renee mentioned the wedding venue, Sylvia said she supposed it was charming in its way. That was the introduction. The years that followed were a longer version of the same conversation. At Tate family dinners, Sylvia spoke about her colleagues the way other people speak about landmarks, their titles, their research, their hospital affiliations, their second homes. She did it in front of Everett without looking at him, which was a more precise cruelty than looking at him would have been. At the St. Augustine Holiday Gala in their second year of marriage, a cardiologist whose name Everett would not remember asked Renee how she and Sylvia were related, and Renee said mother and daughter, and the cardiologist said what a remarkable family, and turned to speak to someone else. Everett stood at Renee's side and was not introduced. Renee did not introduce him. That was the wound that Sylvia delivered, and Renee administered, not violence, erasure. Sylvia's arsenal was precise. She questioned Everett's ambition in the language of concern. Had he thought about going back for a graduate degree? Had he looked into management consulting? There was a program her colleague's son had completed that had really opened doors. She noted what their home could have been with a different ceiling on the budget. She compared their neighborhood, gently, to the neighborhood where she had raised Renee, just noting the differences, the way one notes the weather. Everett thought about his father often during those years. He thought about Calvin in the folding chair in the law office in 2004, watching a room full of men in good suits negotiate around him like he was furniture, saying nothing, signing what needed to be signed, and leaving with more than anyone in that room understood. He thought about the thing Calvin told him that evening on the porch, with the fig tree dark behind them. Quiet money stays quiet until you need it to be loud. He tried once to address it directly. This was in year 3 after Thanksgiving dinner at the Tate House, when Sylvia had referred to Everett's work as administrative support in front of 4 of her colleagues. In the car on the way home, he told Renee quietly that he needed her to say something when her mother did that. He was not asking for a defense. He was asking for a presence. He was asking her to acknowledge, in some small, visible way, that she knew he was there. Renee was quiet for a long time. Then she said her mother meant well. She said he was being sensitive. She said Sylvia was from a generation that measured people a certain way, and it wasn't personal. She said it, and then she looked out the window and the conversation was over. After that, Everett made a private decision. He would not raise it again. He would not perform hurt for an audience that had decided not to see it. He would endure and observe and say nothing. He would be, as his father had been, the quietest man in every room. It was that decision that was running through the back of his mind one evening in Year 5 when he came home early and heard Renee's voice from the back of the house. She was on the phone. She was telling someone, her college roommate, her voice easy and unguarded in the way it only was when she thought she was alone, that she had married Everett because she was tired, and he was safe. He stood in the hallway with his keys still in his hand. He did not say anything. He set his keys on the table and went into the kitchen and put a pot of water on the stove because he had planned to make pasta, and he was still going to make pasta. That was the kind of man he was. But he heard it. He filed it. And it settled into place alongside everything else he had been quietly collecting. That comment was 3 years ago. What happened in the 3 years after is what made James Morrow's warning make sense. He signed it because he trusted her. What the panel returned is what Raymond Child spent 2 years quietly preparing for. Raymond's office was on the 14th floor of a downtown building that had been there since before either of them was born. The elevator was slow, and the carpet in the hallway was the color of old bourbon, and the receptionist, a woman named Gloria, who had worked for Raymond for 19 years, took one look at Everett when he came through the door and said she was sorry about his father, even though Calvin had been gone for 5 years now, because that was the kind of office it was, the kind where grief had a shelf life measured in decades, not months. Everett sat across from Raymond Childs, and he was composed in a way that was different from the composure he had worn in the hospital. That composure had been protective. A wall. This one was something else. This was a man who had slept 2 nights on the decision he had already made and was now ready to understand the full weight of what he was holding. Raymond set a folder on the desk between them. He did not open it immediately. He looked at Everett the way Calvin used to look at him before delivering information that required sitting down, which Everett already was, but the instinct was the same. Then Raymond began to talk. Calvin Okafor had sold Okafor Systems in 2004 to a regional health technology firm called Meridian Data Group for a purchase price of $2.3 million. That number was not the important number. The important number was in the terms Calvin negotiated as a condition of the sale, a 12% royalty stake on every licensed installation of the system, in perpetuity, paid quarterly into a designated trust. Meridian had agreed because they believed the system would have a limited run. They were wrong. The platform was adopted by 11 hospitals in the first 2 years, then 30 by 2012, then 47 across 6 states by the time Calvin died in 2019. The system was now embedded so deeply in the operational infrastructure of those hospitals that replacing it would cost more than the hospitals were willing to spend. Nobody was replacing it. The trust generated $1.9 million annually. It had been compounding, untouched, for 5 years. The current value of the Okafor Systems Royalty Trust was $11.4 million. Everett sat with that number for a moment. He did not react to it the way a person reacts to a surprise. He reacted to it the way a person reacts to finally seeing a photograph of something they have always known existed, but never looked at directly. Recognition, not shock. Raymond was not finished. He turned to the second document in the folder. St. Augustine Medical Center, he said, was installation number 11. They had been running Okafor Systems since 2008. For 16 years, the hospital had been paying licensing fees into the trust, but Calvin had built an escalation clause into the original agreement, a standard rate adjustment tied to the number of active patient records processed per quarter. That clause had never been enforced. Raymond had identified the discrepancy 2 years ago during a routine audit of the trust accounts. The underbilling, calculated conservatively, came to $4.2 million over 6 years. The renegotiated rate, once activated, would increase St. Augustine's annual licensing fee by 60%. Everett looked at Raymond. He thought about the terminal on the wall beside the NICU entrance. He thought about Sylvia's hand moving across that screen with the authority of a woman who owned the room she was in. Raymond set down a third document. This one was a property record. The family home, the house on Callaway Drive, that Everett and Renee had purchased 6 years ago, was titled solely in the name of Everett Calvin Okafor. The purchase had been funded by a single trust distribution, the only withdrawal Everett had ever taken from the account. Renee had asked him once, early in the process, where the down payment was coming from, and he had said savings, which was true in the way that most things he said were true, precisely, without elaboration. She had never asked again. She had certainly never examined the deed. Raymond let that settle for a moment. Then he reached into the folder one final time. He produced a single sheet of paper. A licensing audit notice dated 2 years prior, addressed to the Chief Financial Officer of St. Augustine Medical Center. Unsigned, unfiled. Raymond explained that Calvin had instructed him to prepare it. Calvin had told him, in the last year of his life, that the day would come when Everett would be ready to use what he had built. Raymond was to hold the notice until that day arrived and not before. He was to use his judgment about when the phone call meant the day had come. The phone call 2 nights ago in the hospital hallway had meant the day had come. Everett was quiet for a long time after that. He was thinking about his father sitting in a folding chair in a law office at 51 years old, watching men in good suits negotiate around him and saying nothing and leaving with more than any of them understood. He was thinking about the fig tree in the backyard of the house on Desmond Street that nobody planted, that was just there one spring, that Calvin said was reason enough to stay. He was thinking about quiet money. He was thinking about 8 years of dinners and galas and car rides home, and a woman who told her friend she married him because she was tired. He looked at Raymond. He asked one question: how clean can we make this? Raymond picked up his pen. His answer was completely. But the order of operations, he said, matters very much. Raymond's answer was completely. But the order of operations, he said, matters very much. They spent the better part of 3 days mapping it. Raymond had a yellow legal pad that he wrote on in a small, precise hand, and by the end of their second meeting the page was full of numbered steps and arrows and amounts, the kind of document that looked unremarkable to anyone who didn't understand what it described and devastating to anyone who did. The strategy was surgical. That was the word Raymond used, and it was the right one. Not a blunt instrument, not noise. Each step would follow the last with clean legal logic, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, the sequence would already be irreversible. Step 1 was the audit notice. Raymond filed it through the trust entity, Okafor Legacy Holdings, the name Calvin had chosen years before. Everett understood why names on documents mattered. No mention of Everett. No mention of the family connection. Just a formal notification to the Chief Financial Officer of St. Augustine Medical Center that the licensing agreement for Okafor Systems was entering a mandatory audit and rate renegotiation period, effective immediately, pursuant to Clause 7 of the original 2004 agreement, the clause Calvin built in, the clause nobody had enforced in 20 years. The notice was 3 paragraphs long and written in language so precise it could have been wallpaper until you understood what it was asking for. Raymond sent it on a Tuesday morning. Step 2 was the divorce filing. Raymond had a family law colleague, a woman named Patricia Osey, who handled the paperwork with the same quiet efficiency. Renee was served at home on a Wednesday afternoon, not at the hospital, not in front of colleagues or nurses or anyone whose opinion she needed to manage. At home, where she would have to sit with it in the rooms she had shared with Everett for 8 years, surrounded by furniture they had chosen together, in a house whose deed she had never once examined. Step 3 followed automatically from Step 2. The asset disclosure demand was a standard component of the divorce proceeding, and it would force the property record into the legal file. Renee's attorney would perform a title search. What the title search returned would not be what Renee expected. Raymond did not need to do anything else to make that happen. The legal process would do it on its own. Step 4 was the most elegant piece of the whole operation. Raymond did not contact the journalist directly. He did not provide information. He made a single phone call to a woman named Danielle Reeves at a healthcare technology publication, and he asked her one question: had she ever looked into the ownership history of the Okafor Systems Royalty Trust? He said nothing else. He did not need to. Danielle Reeves had been covering healthcare technology for 11 years. She knew how to pull public trust records. She knew what to do with a thread once someone handed her the end of it. Everett's role throughout all of this was to be exactly who he had always been. He went to work. He answered texts. He sat in his mother Loretta's kitchen on a Sunday and ate her pot roast and listened to gospel radio, and did not tell her what was moving beneath the surface of his life, because she had worried about him for 8 years, and he was not going to give her one more day of it until he had something better to replace the worry with. She looked at him across the table, the way mothers look when they know something has shifted but are waiting to be told. He looked back at her and said the pot roast was perfect, which it was, and she pressed her lips together and did not push. He visited Calvin's grave on a Thursday afternoon. The cemetery was on the east side of the city, 15 minutes from the house on Desmond Street. Everett parked and walked to the plot and stood there for a while without saying anything. He had not been there since the first anniversary of Calvin's death, and the grass around the stone had the particular tended look of a place that was cared for without being visited. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his father's old business card, the one from 2004, the year of the sale, the year everything that was now unfolding had been quietly set in motion. Calvin Okafor, systems contractor, a phone number that no longer worked, an email address from a provider that no longer existed. He set it against the base of the stone. He stood there another few minutes. Then he walked back to his car. There was nothing to say. His father had already said everything. He had said it in a law office in 2004, and in a clause in a contract that nobody read, and in a pre-prepared audit notice held in a file for 2 years, waiting for the right morning. He had said it in a kitchen on Desmond Street with a fig tree in the backyard and a boy watching him work, learning what it looked like when a man built something that would last. Everett drove home. That Friday evening he sat at his desk in his home office and worked through a backlog of system maintenance tickets that had nothing to do with any of this. At 7:43 his phone buzzed on the desk beside the keyboard. A text from Raymond, 2 words, "It's moving." Everett read it once. He set the phone back down, he finished the ticket he was working on, saved it, and turned off his monitor. St. Augustine's chief financial officer had opened that audit notice on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Sylvia Tate's world had begun to crack. The audit notice landed on the chief financial officer's desk on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning it was in the hands of the hospital's legal team. By Wednesday afternoon the IT department had pulled the original licensing agreement and confirmed what the notice claimed. The escalation clause was real. The underbilling was real. $4.2 million over 6 years, sitting in a contract nobody had read closely since the year it was signed. The emergency budget meeting was called for Thursday. Sylvia was not in that meeting. She was 3 floors up, running cardiology rounds, unaware that the building she had worked in for 30 years was quietly reorganizing its finances around a number that had her department's name on it. She found out Friday morning. The memo came from hospital administration, 2 paragraphs. Department-wide cost restructuring effective the following quarter, 2 positions eliminated. The fellowship sponsorship she had personally arranged for Dr. Aaliyah Brooks, a young resident she had been mentoring for 18 months, a woman she had told colleagues was the most promising cardiologist she had trained in a decade, was discontinued immediately. Funding withdrawn, position closed. Sylvia read it twice. Then she picked up the phone and called the chief financial officer. He did not have much to say. He said the licensing audit had revealed significant budget exposure. He said the adjustments were necessary. He said he was sorry about Dr. Brooks. She had to tell her department herself. That afternoon, In the conference room at the end of the cardiology hall, with her staff seated around the table looking at her, she delivered the news in the measured tone of a woman who had spent 40 years not showing weakness in professional settings. Dr. Brooks sat in the second row. She did not cry. She just looked at Sylvia with an expression that asked a question Sylvia could not answer. The room was different after that. Something had shifted in it. It was subtle, the way the air changes in a house after a difficult conversation. Technically the same, but not the same. Across the city, on a Wednesday of the following week, Renee opened her front door to a process server. She called Sylvia before she finished reading the papers. Sylvia was there within the hour, moving through Renee's front door with the purposeful energy of a woman arriving to fix a problem. She looked at the divorce filing. She looked at the asset disclosure demand attached to it. Then she told Renee to call her attorney immediately and document everything she owned. The attorney performed a title search the following morning. It came back wrong. The house on Callaway Drive, the one Renee had been planning to list as her primary asset, the one she had been living in for 6 years, was titled solely in the name of Everett Calvin Okafor. The purchase had been funded not by savings, as she had assumed, but by a single distribution from a trust she had never heard of. Her attorney called her with this information in a voice that was carefully neutral. Then he told her he was withdrawing from the case pending full financial disclosure of the trust structure. He could not properly represent her without understanding what she was actually dealing with. Renee called Everett. He answered on the second ring. His voice was calm. It was the same voice he used for everything, measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided something and was at peace with the decision. She asked him what was happening. He said Raymond Childs would be in touch with her attorney. Then he asked if the twins were doing well. She did not answer. She hung up. That same afternoon, the healthcare technology article went live. The publication was a trade journal with a readership of roughly 40,000 professionals in hospital administration, health informatics, and medical technology. The piece was 4,000 words. It began with a photograph of Calvin Okafor at his drafting table in 1998, a young man in a plaid shirt surrounded by server equipment, squinting slightly against a camera flash. The headline called him a quiet architect of the modern hospital record. The article traced the history of Okafor Systems from its origins in a spare bedroom on Desmond Street to its current installation in 47 hospitals across 6 states. It named the Royalty Trust. It named the sole beneficiary. It named Everett. The first colleague forwarded the link to Sylvia at 2:14 in the afternoon, the second at 3:40, the third at 4:07, with a note that said simply, "Did you see this?" Sylvia sat at her desk with all 3 messages open and the article loading on her screen and the audit memo still sitting in her inbox from the week before, and she began to understand for the first time the actual dimensions of what she had been standing inside. Renee came to her office that evening. She closed the door. She stood in front of her mother's desk and asked one question in a voice that had gone very flat. "Did you know?" Sylvia looked at her daughter, and she told her the truth. No, that single word did something to the room. It did not repair anything, it did not soften anything, but it changed the geography of blame in a way that could not be unchanged. Renee had arrived expecting a co-conspirator. She left with something colder, the understanding that the woman who had engineered her contempt for Everett had been just as blind as she was. Sylvia called James Morrow the next morning. He came to her office and sat across from her and listened while she asked him why. He said he had made a promise to a man he respected. He said Everett Okafor was the kind of man that happened once in a generation, and he had not been willing to let him walk out of that hospital without knowing what the chart said. He said if he had it to do again, he would do it exactly the same way. Then he stood up and left. Sylvia sat alone in her office for a long time after that. The article was on her screen. The audit memo was beside it. The fellowship memo was in her drawer. Outside her window, St. Augustine Medical Center went about its business on a system her son-in-law's father had built, processing charts and orders and records with the quiet efficiency of infrastructure that does not need to announce itself to function. She finally understood what she had missed. She sent Everett a message that evening requesting a meeting. He replied the next morning. One sentence, my building, my time. Raymond will send you the details. Everett arrived 20 minutes early. He chose his seat with the same quiet deliberateness he applied to everything. Back to the window, face to the door. The afternoon light came in low and warm behind him, which meant that anyone sitting across the table would have to look into it to look at him. He had not planned this consciously. It was simply what his father would have done. Raymond took the chair to Everett's right and set his briefcase on the floor and folded his hands on the table. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to discuss. The plan had been executed. The sequence had run. What remained was the final accounting, and both men understood that Everett would conduct it in his own time, in his own register, without assistance. The terminal on the wall behind Sylvia's chair read, Okafor Systems, version 4.2. Everett looked at it once when he sat down. Then he looked at the door. They came in together. Sylvia first, which told him everything about how she had framed this meeting in her own mind. She was still the senior figure, still the one who set the order of entry. She wore her white coat, which she had not needed to wear, to an administrative conference room on a Thursday afternoon. But she had worn it anyway because it was armor, and because this was her hospital, and she needed both of those things to be true when she walked through that door. Renee followed. She looked like a woman who had not slept well in 3 weeks, which was accurate. Sylvia sat down and looked at Everett and began to speak in the measured, authoritative tone she had used on fellows and residents and hospital committees for 30 years. She said this situation had gone far enough. She said the legal maneuvering was unnecessary and damaging to everyone involved, including the twins, who deserved better than this kind of instability in their first weeks of life. She said she was prepared to discuss a resolution that was fair to all parties. She said the word fair the way people say it, when they mean favorable to themselves. She said more after that. Everett let her say it. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his face entirely still, and he let her finish every sentence, including the last one, which was something about the kind of man she had hoped Renee would build a life with. She let that land. And then she stopped talking, because she had run out of prepared material, and the room was very quiet. Everett looked at her for a moment. Then he began. He said he wanted to go back to the beginning, not to argue, just to make sure everyone in the room understood what the beginning actually was. He said the beginning was a dinner table in year 1, when she had referred to his work as administrative support in front of 4 of her colleagues, and Renee had not said a word. He named the colleagues, he named the dinner. He said the beginning was the holiday gala in year 2, when a cardiologist had asked how Sylvia and Renee were related, and Renee had answered without introducing him. He said the beginning was the car ride home from Thanksgiving in year 3, when he had asked his wife, quietly, simply, to acknowledge that he was present, and she had told him he was being sensitive. He said the beginning was the morning she told Renee to protect herself. The meaning and the instruction underneath it had not been subtle. He had heard it. He had filed it. He said he had spent 8 years filing things, which was, after all, what he was trained to do. Then he told them about his father. He told them about Calvin Okafor, and the 35 years of hospital corridors and network cables and early mornings, and a system built in a spare bedroom on Desmond Street that was now running in 47 hospitals across 6 states. He told them about the 2004 sale and the royalty clause and the trust that had been compounding, untouched, for 5 years. He told it plainly, the way Calvin would have told it. No drama, no performance, just facts arranged in their correct sequence. He watched Sylvia's face while he talked. He watched the authority drain out of it slowly, the way color leaves a face when the body understands something the mind is still refusing. Then he said the part she needed to hear most. He said, "You spent 8 years telling Renee she married beneath her, and she spent those same 8 years proving you right in the worst possible way. But what you did not know, Sylvia, what you could not have known because you never once looked closely enough at the man you were dismissing, was that every chart you pulled, every order you wrote, every note you entered about my marriage in this building, all of it ran through something my father built. And I have been collecting a check for it every single month you were looking down at me." The room was absolutely silent. Sylvia opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked like a woman standing in a house she had lived in for 30 years, who had just discovered the foundation was someone else's. Renee was crying. Not for effect, not for leverage. The kind of crying that happens when a person finally understands the full weight of what they chose and did not choose, and there is nothing left to do with that understanding except feel it. Everett looked at Renee for a long moment. He said he wished her well. He said he meant that. He said Raymond would handle everything that remained, and that it would be handled fairly because that was the kind of man he was, and had always been, in case there was any remaining question. Then he stood. He buttoned his jacket, one button, the way Calvin had taught him to button a jacket when leaving a room where important things had been said. He thanked Raymond. He walked to the door. At the threshold he paused, the way he had paused in the NICU hallway 3 weeks ago. His eyes moved to the terminal on the wall. Okafor Systems, version 4.2. He looked at it for 3 seconds. He said nothing. He walked out and pulled the door closed behind him, softly, the way his father had taught him to close important things. That was a Thursday. By the following spring, the rest had settled into its permanent shape. By the following spring, the shape of things had become permanent. Sylvia Tate still held her title at St. Augustine Medical Center. Her name was still on her office door. She still made rounds, still wrote orders, still moved through the cardiology unit with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 4 decades building a professional identity inside those walls. But something had shifted in the room whenever she entered it, the way a room shifts after a difficult truth has been spoken in it. Her department had 2 empty chairs. The fellowship position she had sponsored for Dr. Aaliyah Brooks was never refilled. 2 colleagues who had worked alongside her for more than a decade submitted transfer requests in the same month, citing professional development opportunities at other institutions. Nobody said anything directly. They didn't have to. Institutions have long memories, and the story of the licensing audit and the royalty trust and the man Sylvia had spent 8 years dismissing had circulated through St. Augustine's medical technology circles with a thoroughness that no memo could have matched. She practiced medicine. She was good at it. She would always be good at it. But the room was different now, and it would stay different. Renee settled the divorce in early spring. The terms were fair. Everett had instructed Raymond to make them fair, which was the kind of instruction that said everything about the man giving it. She received a financial settlement that was reasonable and honest, and bore no resemblance to the position she had assumed she was negotiating from. The house on Callaway Drive was sold. The proceeds went to Everett as the titled owner, minus Renee's negotiated share. It was not what she had planned. It was not a punishment either. It was simply what the document said, applied without malice. She was last seen at St. Augustine on a Tuesday in March, walking from the parking structure to the main entrance alone, in a coat Everett had never seen before, moving with the quiet self-possession of a woman relearning what it felt like to occupy her own life. He was not watching. He heard it from James Morrow, who mentioned it briefly and without commentary because that was the kind of man Morrow was. What Everett did with the trust was this. He made one withdrawal. One intentional, deliberate, irreversible use of what Calvin had built. And he aimed it exactly where his father would have aimed it. The Calvin Okafor Memorial Scholarship was announced on a Saturday morning at the Northside Community Center on Briar Street, 3 blocks from the church where Calvin had been a deacon for 22 years. The scholarship was a full ride to any accredited historically black college or university for students pursuing degrees in information technology, computer science, or systems engineering. The first cohort was 3 students. 2 were from the city. 1 had driven 4 hours with her grandmother to be there. Each of them received a folder with their award letter, a photograph of Calvin at his drafting table in 1998, and a handwritten note from Everett that said simply, "He built something. Now you will too." Loretta Okafor sat in the front row in a navy dress she had bought specifically for the occasion and a hat that had belonged to Calvin's mother. She did not make a speech. She had been asked if she wanted to say a few words, and she had declined because she understood that the occasion was not about her grief or her pride, both of which were considerable. She just sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and watched her son stand at the podium and speak about his father in the same measured, unhurried voice Calvin had used for everything that mattered. James Morrow was there. He sat in the 3rd row and applauded with the rest of the room. When the event ended and people were moving toward the folding tables where Loretta's church friends had laid out pound cake and sweet tea and those small finger sandwiches that appear at every dignified community gathering in every city in America, Morrow found Everett near the door. They shook hands. Morrow held the handshake for a moment longer than a casual one. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. There was a woman named Celeste Warren standing near the refreshments table when Everett turned around. She taught high school mathematics across town. She had come with a mutual friend who had insisted she attend without fully explaining why. She was looking at the photograph of Calvin that had been enlarged and mounted on a foam board near the entrance, and when Everett walked over, she said without preamble that his father had kind eyes. Everett looked at the photograph and said he did. She asked if he was always that serious in pictures or just when someone had a camera. Everett said he was like that all the time, but that he had a laugh that was worth waiting for. Celeste smiled at that. She said she knew a few people like that. They talked for a while near the refreshment table, with the pound cake between them and the afternoon light coming through the community center windows. And it was easy the way some conversations are easy, not because everything is simple, but because both people are being exactly who they are. That Monday, Everett drove his Camry to work. He sat at his desk. He answered his tickets. He updated a system configuration that needed updating. At 5:15, he saved his work, locked his screen, and stood up. He turned off the lamp on his desk. He picked up his keys. He locked his office and turned off the light and went home. And that is where this story ends, not with an explosion, not with a ceremony. With a quiet man going home, in full possession of everything he had always been. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about money. It is not about revenge. It is about the cost of underestimating a person who has chosen deliberately and with full knowledge to be still. Quiet men are not weak men. Hidden strength is still strength. And the most powerful thing a person can do, in a world that mistakes silence for surrender, is refuse to explain themselves until the moment is exactly right. Calvin Okafor knew that. He taught his son, and his son remembered. Now I want to ask you something. If you had been in Everett's position, 8 years of being erased, then a whisper in a hospital hallway, then the discovery that you had been holding the key the whole time, what would you have done? Would you have acted sooner? Would you have walked away entirely? Or would you have done exactly what Everett did? Waited, planned, and let the moment arrive on its own terms? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do that too, because there is another story coming that you are absolutely not going to want to miss. I will see you in the next one.